Picture this: one day you're tucking your son into bed, and the next, you're told he legally belongs to someone else. That's not a nightmare, that's what my wife's family pulled on me. They thought they had me cornered, thought they'd won. But here's the twist: what they signed for wasn't just custody. It was a trap they didn't even realize they'd walked into. And the way it all unraveled? You're going to want to hear every second of it. The day I opened that letter from the court, my world stopped. My son, my little boy, wasn't mine anymore. His custody had been handed over to my wife's family. Just like that, with a single piece of paper, I was erased from his life. I remember staring at the words, reading them over and over, hoping I had misunderstood. But no, it was real. They had taken him. And the worst part? I hadn't even seen it coming. It felt like someone had pulled the ground out from under me. One moment, I was a father. The next, I was nothing more than a spectator. And as the shock sank in, one thought kept pounding in my head: how did this happen? How could they do this? And what did they really sign themselves up for? When I first married my wife, I thought I was stepping into a bigger family. You know, the kind of family that celebrates holidays together, shares meals, and supports each other. But her parents had a different idea. To them, I wasn't a son-in-law, I was an outsider. They had money, influence, and this unspoken belief that their daughter had married beneath her. At first, I brushed it off. I'd show up at dinners, smile through the subtle digs, and try to prove myself. But the cracks were always there. They'd make decisions without asking us, like choosing which school our son should attend before he was even old enough to walk. They'd talk about what's best for the family, but what they really meant was what's best for them. It wasn't just the big things, either. Even the small moments carried weight. I remember one afternoon when I suggested taking my son to the park. Her mother looked at me and said, "We'll decide what's good for him." That sentence stuck with me. It was like they believed my role as a father was optional, something they could override whenever they wanted. Looking back, those early signs were warnings. The family had always wanted control, and they weren't shy about showing it. I just didn't realize how far they were willing to go to get it. It all came down to a stack of papers. Nothing dramatic, no courtroom scene, no shouting match. Just a quiet afternoon when my wife's family slid a document across the table. They called it a temporary guardianship form. Something to help out while I was dealing with work and stress. I didn't think twice. I signed it, believing it was harmless, a short-term arrangement to keep things smooth. Weeks later, I got the shock of my life. That so-called guardianship form wasn't temporary at all. It was a full custody transfer. And the court had already stamped it, making it official. In one careless moment, I had signed away my rights as a father. No warnings, no second chances. Just a legal trap disguised as help. Looking back, the way they orchestrated it was calculated. They knew I trusted them enough to sign without reading every line. They knew the system well enough to push it through quickly. And they knew that once the ink was dry, I'd be powerless to undo it. It wasn't just betrayal, it was strategy. That's the thing about custody battles. They're not always about who loves the child more. Sometimes, they're about who understands the paperwork better, who moves faster, and who plays dirtier. And in that moment, I realized I had been outplayed. The moment I realized what had happened, I went into panic mode. I couldn't just sit there, this was my son. I called lawyers, begged for advice, tried to find loopholes. Every conversation ended the same way: "You signed it. It's binding." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the chest. I remember pacing the living room, phone in hand, calling anyone I thought could help. Friends, legal contacts, even distant relatives who had dealt with custody issues. Everyone told me the same thing: once the court stamps it, undoing it is nearly impossible. I felt trapped, like I had walked into a cage and locked the door myself. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I could have been so blind. My son was still alive, still out there, but suddenly I had no say in his life. No decisions, no authority. Just a father stripped of his rights, watching from the sidelines. And yet, even in that chaos, one thought kept me moving: I wasn't going to give up. I didn't know how, but I had to find a way to fight back. Because if I didn't, they'd raise my son believing I was nothing more than a mistake his mother made. Once the papers were signed, everything changed overnight. My wife's family didn't waste a second stepping into their new role. Suddenly, they were the ones making every decision about my son's life. Where he went to school, which doctor he saw, even what activities he was allowed to join, all of it was under their control. I remember trying to suggest a weekend trip to the zoo. Something simple, something fun. Her father looked at me and said, "We'll decide what's best for him." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about the zoo. It was about the fact that I no longer had a voice. I was reduced to asking permission to spend time with my own child. They controlled the schedule down to the hour. If I wanted to see my son, it had to be approved. If I wanted to call him, it had to be supervised. It felt like I was visiting a relative, not raising my own kid. And the worst part? My son started noticing. He'd ask me why I had to leave early, why I couldn't stay longer. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't break his heart. That's the reality of custody. It's not just a word on paper. It's power. And once they had it, they used it to push me out of every corner of his life. I was a father in name only, watching from the sidelines while they played the role they thought they deserved. For weeks, I felt like I was drowning. Every attempt to fight back ended in failure. But then, something caught my eye. Late one night, I was rereading the custody papers, not because I thought I'd find anything new, but because I couldn't sleep. That's when I noticed a line buried deep in the fine print. A clause I hadn't paid attention to before. It said that whoever held custody was fully responsible for every financial obligation tied to the child. Medical bills, education costs, therapy sessions, insurance gaps, all of it. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I remembered something: my son had a medical condition. One that hadn't fully surfaced yet, but was about to demand serious care. That's when it hit me. By taking custody, my wife's family hadn't just taken control of my son's life. They had taken on every single responsibility that came with it. And unlike me, they weren't prepared for what that meant. They thought custody was about power. They didn't realize it was also about sacrifice. I sat there, staring at that clause, realizing the tables had just turned. They had signed themselves into a trap. And for the first time since losing custody, I felt a spark of hope. Because now, I knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. It didn't take long for reality to hit them. My son's medical condition started showing signs that required constant care. Doctor visits turned into hospital stays. Prescriptions turned into treatments. And with every appointment, the bills stacked higher and higher. At first, they tried to handle it quietly. They had money, after all. But medical expenses don't care about pride. Insurance only covered part of it, and the rest came straight out of their pockets. Tens of thousands, month after month. The family that once flaunted their wealth now whispered about cutting costs, selling assets, even borrowing. I remember hearing from a mutual friend that they had canceled vacations, downsized their lifestyle, and started arguing among themselves. The same people who once told me I wasn't good enough were now drowning in responsibilities they never expected. And the best part? They couldn't escape. The clause made it clear: custody meant full responsibility. There was no backing out. Watching them struggle wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. They had taken my son thinking it was a trophy, a way to prove their superiority. But custody isn't a prize, it's a burden. And now, they were learning that lesson the hard way. By the time we stepped into the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. I wasn't the same man who had once signed those papers blindly. I was sharper now, fueled by months of pain and a single truth buried in the fine print. Across from me sat my wife's family, exhausted, drained, their confidence stripped away by the weight of responsibility they couldn't carry. The judge asked them to explain how they planned to meet the obligations of custody. Their lawyer shuffled papers, tried to stall, but the numbers spoke louder than words. Hospital bills, therapy costs, education fees, all stacked against them like a mountain they couldn't climb. Every attempt to justify themselves collapsed under the reality of what they had signed. I stood up and spoke directly, my voice steady but sharp. You wanted custody, and you got it. But custody isn't about control. It's about sacrifice. It's about showing up when it hurts, paying the price when it's heavy, and never walking away. You thought you were punishing me, but all you did was punish yourselves. Her father tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him. The courtroom fell quiet. For the first time, they had no comeback, no arrogance to hide behind. They sat there, realizing the trap they had set for me had snapped shut on them instead. That moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. The truth that parenting isn't a game, and custody isn't a trophy. It's a burden, one they had claimed without understanding. And now, in front of everyone, they had to face the consequences of their own pride. After the confrontation, the cracks in their armor widened fast. My wife's family tried to hold on, but the weight of responsibility was crushing them. The bills kept coming, the stress mounted, and the arguments behind closed doors grew louder. They had fought so hard to take custody, but now they were fighting just to stay afloat. Eventually, they couldn't hide it anymore. Their lawyer admitted what they had been too proud to say themselves: they weren't capable of raising my son. The court didn't need convincing. Custody isn't about appearances, it's about who can actually carry the responsibility. And the truth was clear. They couldn't. I could. The judge's ruling felt surreal. After months of being sidelined, I was finally recognized again as my son's rightful guardian. There was no celebration, no dramatic applause. Just a quiet statement from the bench: custody restored. And with those words, the fight was over. When my son came back home, it wasn't some grand reunion. He walked in, dropped his backpack by the door, and went straight to his toys. To him, it was just another day. But for me, it was everything. Watching him sit on the floor, humming to himself, I realized I had my life back. The silence of that moment carried more weight than any courtroom victory ever could. My wife's family left the courthouse defeated, carrying the burden of their own choices. They had tried to erase me, but in the end, they erased themselves. And I walked away with something they could never take again: the bond between a father and his child. When my son came back home, life didn't suddenly turn perfect. There were still challenges, still scars from the battle we had just survived. But what changed was the understanding of what custody really means. It isn't about winning or losing. It isn't about pride or control. It's about responsibility, the kind that weighs heavy, the kind that demands sacrifice every single day. My wife's family thought custody was a trophy, something they could hold up to prove they were right. But custody isn't a prize. It's a promise. A promise to carry the weight no matter how heavy it gets. And when they realized that, they crumbled. Because responsibility doesn't bend to arrogance. It exposes it. For me, the fight wasn't about revenge. It was about showing my son that I would never stop fighting for him. That no matter how many papers were signed, no matter how many obstacles were thrown in my way, I would always find a path back to him. And that's what being a parent is: not perfection, not control, but persistence. This story taught me something I'll carry forever: love isn't measured in victories, it's measured in endurance. Custody can be taken on paper, but the bond between a parent and child? That's untouchable. And if there's one truth I want you to walk away with, it's this: when arrogance collides with reality, reality always wins. And sometimes, the hardest battles leave behind the clearest lessons.